Thank you. I'd like to ask for just another brief prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, as we come together, I wish to just serve your will and let it be known that as we try to reflect your Son's character, that's how you'll be known by. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Oh, can't step away. Okay, thanks for reading that, Debbie. I appreciate that. If anything, we'll keep those verses in mind. Candide. It's basically the French title of a novel, small novel written by Voltaire. Latin candidus, which means white or giving the idea of wide-eyed innocence or lack of corruption, and sweet, if you will. And Voltaire, that was one of his pen names, and I work with some of this French. I could probably, I should ask him for all the pronunciation, but he was born in 1694 Paris. He was educated by Jesuits at the College of Le Grand, and he's noted for satirizing many rich and powerful people. He was imprisoned in the Bastille in 1717. He was released 2 years and later sent again in 1726. He was soon paroled on condition that he leave France, so during his exile, he met people like Alexander Pope, Congreve, and Jonathan Swift. Jonathan Swift, of course, wrote Gulliver's Travels, and he kind of based a lot of the premise of Candide, on that style. And he kind of a bit of an Anglophile, so he started kind of like admiring the way the English had a more of a parliamentary system. He kind of wrote it in response to rationalist philosophers like Spinoza and Leibniz. They were known as like optimistic philosophers, and that would be the subtitle of Candide, optimism. Or one of the main characters that he satirizes is the philosopher Leibniz. He named him Pangloss, which is just a word that means all tongue. So he called him a bit of a just a philosopher, or what Paul would run into being called a babbler when he was in Athens. I kind of believe that Voltaire never really in his heart was against the optimistic view, and I believe that he was kind of unfair to Leibniz. Leibniz was a genius, a mathematical genius, but he kind of characterized him unfairly in the story. Candide is kind of a burlesque. And it's kind of a fast-paced little story that he apparently wrote in 4 days and for his niece. He wasn't really, it would seem almost anti-religious. I think he almost spoofs everything in it. It kind of runs like an episode of Seinfeld. I don't know what Seinfeld is, but he runs like an episode of Seinfeld, and where all the characters, even if they seemingly die, they all keep coming back together over and over again, and they affect each other's lives. Excuse me a second. But it would seem anti-religious. He kind of goes against, actually it is in a way, because he goes against all religions. But I think basically he was it's a story against corrupt power, whether that be a monarchy or a theodic or the clergy. He was against anybody that was corrupted. Lord Atkins said power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And he was talking about the church. And he was one of those guys, too, that didn't want to leave the church, but he just wanted to, fix things. He wanted to fix the problems. It kind of caught my attention, Candide. It's like things I hear about Voltaire. I was never really versed in a lot of things about philosophers. We hear that, and I think a lot of things, even like with guys like Freud and stuff, we know a lot of the axioms, we know a lot of the phrases, in like Shakespeare, we don't know where it comes from a lot of times. We just get it's so entwined into our culture. I was listening to an audiobook. It was called Plato and the Platypus Walk into a Bar. And so it was about explaining philosophy in terms of jokes. And I think I got caught up in that, because of Paul in Athens when he talked to the Epicureans and and the Stoics. And I kind of believe, like, the Holy Spirit works in me. I don't consider myself the greatest pious of a person, but I think I constantly think in terms of God, not even to brag, but I mean, that's why I say I don't think I'm considered a good person, but I think a lot of my thoughts do revolve around those things. And I think when things come to me or experiences, I attribute it to that. It'd be more of a Leibniz kind of attitude, because as Pangloss and as Leibniz would say, this is the best of all possible worlds. So whatever you're going through, whatever the world situation is, it is for the best. And of course, Voltaire countered that, and he did have a point, because you can't tell anybody that's in distress or trouble that, hey, this is all for the best, that they've lost a loved one or they suffered a tragedy. So I'm listening to this, and it's late at night. I usually listen to audiobooks to go to sleep, and they made a reference to the earthquake in Lisbon, Portugal, and in 1775 that this character Candide survived. And it was just like I said, it's like Gulliver's Travels, so everywhere he goes in this misfortune, but he has this internal optimism that, whatever tragedy he's going through, it's for the best. And this is, of course, what the Adventists believe is a fulfillment of prophecy from Revelation 6:12. So, it kind of caught my attention. The effects were felt from Europe, Africa, America, and to an extent Greenland and West Indies and Norway and Sweden. So it was a big earthquake, and you can argue that there was bigger earthquakes, but this came at a certain time and a certain place in history that was very, very prominent, that shaped our world, our lives. And I believe, there is a hand of God. Not that I think I want to counter, like Leibniz, you don't want to say that God causes things to happen to people for, arbitrarily. And this is what caused a lot of people in those days to become theists, because they believed in God, but they couldn't explain it in any other way. Well, if God is all-powerful, then why would this happen? When I first heard about it, I remember even lately we did a seminar, and I was never really impressed with that. Like, okay, that was an earthquake, 1775. What does it mean? There's been other earthquakes. It was a long time ago. So I was never impressed, like, is that a part of prophecy? I just kind of glossed over it and let it go. So okay, if they say so. So I was never really. I was kind of skeptical about it. And I even remember at the one seminar, Matt was, that's a good thing about this day and age, is that, Matt pulled out his phone and he looked it up, So I could always fact check these things. Excuse me, my eclectic notes here. So I had planned on doing that as a sermon, and of course I let things go a bit, but and then I kind of realized that I'm speaking today on Halloween, the All Hallows Eve. It was the day before All Saints Day, a very important Catholic holiday. And of course, Lisbon, Portugal at this time is an incredibly wealthy city. The Portuguese are, like Spain was, a very powerful country. A lot of gold and a lot of money was put into the church. And it didn't even dawn on me that, my sermon, I'm speaking of this, is going to be on that day. It was the perfect storm of things going on. The impact was as a physical damage was one thing, and that's one thing I always think about earthquakes, but then it dawned on me as I heard this story, like Voltaire, not only did he write a poem about it, but he also wrote this story, Candide, as a way of, I think, of a way of dealing with these things. And it was the mental damage that was of this event. And if I try to explain what it caused and change the course of our history, it said both theologians and philosophers, it sent them into wonder and confusion. Both sides couldn't explain to this. And I said it was a result of deism. You probably heard it. I remember even in school being described as the clockmaker. Now like evolution was called the blind clockmaker, that God created everything, but then he just kind of let it go. So that would kind of explain to them why a lot of bad things happened. Thomas Jefferson was a big deist. And that we're talking about the 18th century, the 1700s. It led to our revolution and the French Revolution, and of course most of these philosophers were French. The French actually would have a real bloody revolution compared to ours, and it makes me think about how we start out as a lamb, And then, like America, by comparison to France, Star as Lamb. And then they had this very bloody revolution, Robespierre cutting people's heads off. And then people that were loyal to the revolution, they would later have their heads cut off. It was nobody trusted anything. They didn't like religion. They tried to get rid of everything, confiscated churches. And it was just kind of a backlash because of I think the cruelty of not only the monarchy, but the church, these people. So it was a backlash. So they created this kind of bizarre religion of science almost, of reason. And it kind of like reminds me like the neo-atheists today. Why would you be so bothered by, if you don't believe in God, why would you be kind of radical about it? And of course, you got radical Christians are intolerant. And Voltaire was actually a hero to them at one point because, as they're creating the science, they figured, they just took him as being anti-religious. But I think none of the philosophers that, if I mention any of them today, Hume, Kant, and those guys, none of them were atheists. But this is the time when you argued with any part of the dogma of the church, you skewed any little bit, you were considered an atheist. That's it. I have to mention Descartes because he's one of the first ones. And then the one, my supervisor at work is French. I was saying Descartes, and he kind of reminded me, it's like saying Illinois, and I forget, these are French words, and you don't pronounce those. This event affected the Enlightenment and led to the Great Awakening in America. There's like 4 Great Awakenings, and I think all of them are important to us, but the first one I just said briefly was the precursor to the American Revolution, and it ran around 1730 to 1743. The second Great Awakening was in the United States, and that was in the late 18th century, especially in the Northeast and the Midwest. And the third one you get later on with, where you get Dwight L. Moody, and then the fourth one you get like in the 60s and 70s, you get the charismatic movements. And Descartes kind of started this all out because he's the guy that, he's the Cartesian way of thought, the coordinate system. He can graph points in 3 dimensions and things I don't understand. So a lot of these philosophers, surprisingly, were mathematicians, the way they thought. He's the one that thought about dualism. Your mind is one thing and matter is another. It threatened the church, and he was worried about it because, this is the time of Galileo had trouble with the church for his theories, and he would look at things, very mundane things, and try to find, what can you know? He's the one that came up, I think, therefore I am. So he has to start out thinking he has to bother thinking whether he exists or not. And so with transubstantiation, the wafer turned into Christ, the church really didn't want anyone looking too closely at that, that can a wafer just be a wafer? He also kind of had that Sherlock Holmes method of crime solving. Epistemology, if I could say it, that's a theory of knowledge. So he came up with all this reasoning. And also, after that, you figure out whether you exist or not. You have to figure out if other people exist, and that's the only Halloween reference. It's kind of, people had thought about that for a long time. Do other people matter? Do they exist? And that's called the zombie problem. It's kind of a nickname for it. And originally, Tony was going to be able to talk about, the movie It's a Wonderful Life. And in the movie Jimmy Stewart, one of the main premises of it is he finds out what life is like without him. And of course, we all affect each other. So if we're not acting in a Christian manner, if we're not trying to reflect Christ's character, we do affect people negatively, and that happens in this world. And so these philosophers didn't think, because the one thing I thought about when I'm reading about the philosophers, especially Descartes, was that about Tim Jennings, the God-shaped ring. And so he's thinking about this thing. It's not revolutionary to everybody, but it's like, is God character really that bad? Have we been looking at God and misunderstanding him the whole way? And I don't know a lot about him per se, but I wondered if he knows about these different philosophers, because you would think, well, some people think it's a waste of time, that's in the past, but you got to think, because Descartes himself he was brilliant in some sorts, but he was wrong about a lot of things. He thought the heart was like a furnace that heated the blood up, and that's why it circulates. So a lot of his medical stuff was not that too great. And so it'd be a shame, you get anybody that with this much prestige that he didn't account for what other people have done before him, whether they were right or wrong, or good or bad, where they went right and where they went wrong. But of course, Descartes and these guys would have loved to have known what he'd known. He would have loved to know neuroscience. So The point I wanted to get to, of course, was, and I thought I had a preface to this because this is all going on at the same time. It's the perfect storm of events, and I don't think you would have the denominations in America today. I don't think you would have Seventh-day Adventists unless these things occurred. And I think that's another reason why it was prophesied, not just this big physical explosion, but the actual how it affected people. When I remember being in school, we used to have those disaster drills of tornadoes, and to me it was a big joke. And I always remember this young man. Now I can't mention his name because he's around there somewhere, being 50 years old. But to me, he was a tough little guy, this little James Cagney kind of guy to me. And I swore he was 40 years old back when we were in fourth grade. But I remember seeing how scared he was and upset this tornado drill. I guess I found out later on he had grown up in a trailer park and he had experienced tornadoes. I never did. It came close. It was just, to me, it was an exciting time. So I never had that empathy. And when you look at something like this earthquake, it seems so long ago in a city that, in Portugal that isn't the world power anymore, what does it mean? But I watched a documentary on it, and I probably couldn't relate it as well as if you watched it. But there was churches all over the city. I think they had like 40 churches, and they had like 90 convents. They had activities running that day. This was All Saints' Day. So one of the things they were doing was they're going to punish heretics. And like I said, it didn't take very much to be a heretic. You disagree with any dogma or you had any political differences with anybody important, you're probably going to be executed. So thousands of people are out to watch this kind of thing, and they're watching this guy going to be executed. They don't know their turn's coming real quick. And it's always reminds me of Paul. Paul in Athens talks to the philosophers, but Paul at one time was persecuting Christians, and he thought he was absolutely right, and he felt good about this, and this is what these people felt about these heretics. They thought they were wrong. So tens of thousands of people are in churches, and it's November 1st, All Saints' Day, and it's around 9, little after 9, before 10 o'clock, somewhere in there. And as it is, of course, all the powerful, influential people are up front, and the humble people are in back. So the humble people probably have more of a chance to escape, so it's the first is last and last is first deal. The earthquake hit, and these churches, these stone vaulted churches, just collapsed. So many people just died instantly in the churches. The libraries were leveled, great works of art were leveled. There were it's less than 10 minutes. These things happen fast. I've never been involved in an earthquake, but that much destruction so widespread so quickly. They talk about the Paco de Rivera. It was compared to the Library of Alexander. So it was, because this is a really rich city, they have great works of art, a lot of gold, a lot of money spent on the church. So as you were leaving, if you survived any buildings collapsing, you're walking, and you can't walk anywhere without stepping on a dead body. And there's people that are in the stages of dying. In this documentary, they talk about a merchant. He's doing this. He's going through this process, and he's surviving this like Candide did. And he sees a woman trying to get help for her child, and he sees a stone fall on her head in front of him. So all these people, the survivors, they try to go by the Tagus River, and there's like an open plaza. It's a port by the docks and everything, so they're probably hoping for some kind of escape. So while they're all in the plaza, a 600-mile-an-hour, 2-story high tsunami comes in and wipes them all out to sea. And the merchant that they focused on, he was able to survive because he happened to just be near a log, so he grabbed it, just out of instinct. Even 10 days later in the Atlantic Ocean, the captain was reporting seeing just piles of body in the ocean with furniture. So you have this going on, and people, if you survived the tsunami and you survived the initial earthquake, there's a firestorm started. It's All Saints' Day, so all these churches got candles lit. So the fire starts to spread, and I guess the topography just happens to be right for the winds to carry these fires. And it's something that almost happened to them in recent history, but they have the modern fire departments that are able to get on top of it, but the topography is just cover the winds enough. So all these churches have the candles, they're all burning, they all catch on fire, and they're all moving through the city, and they're all emerging. And the temperatures would get so high that what would happen is the gas in people's heads would explode. This is, reported, there's reports firsthand, and then now the forensic scientists go in there and they look at these things, and this is what happened. They would have cases where, the prisons were breached, of course, and so these prisoners are coming out, and they're robbing and looting and raping, and women would be raped, and after the rape, they would just shoot them. They would have forensic evidence. They would show how they would slice them up with their knife to intimidate them, and then afterwards they would shoot them. And Candide actually, in that story, they actually talk about the invading army. What they would do is, after they raped the women, they would disembowel them. So you hear this a slow kind of death. You hear about these things in war, and that people can be that cruel. And of course, they're taking advantage because now there's lawlessness. Then I think with any disaster like this, you're going to have people starving, you're going to have people without water, and then you're going to have the pestilence and diseases. The one thing, though, it ended the Inquisition there, but after that, of course, the army came in and they set up all these gallows, so anyone robbing or looting would be instantly hanged. And of course, people were probably desperate for something, so they were hanged. And there was also, evidence of cannibalism. And so I kind of looked at the Dinet D'Souza book, God Forsaken, and of course, well, he's originally from India, but he's a Catholic, and of course he wrote all these things about these different questions. And this is just the chapter on what we call natural disasters, or they'll even call them acts of God. Just even reading this, there's a lot of things like, well, I didn't even know to question those things. I don't think of those things, and no wonder why so many people can be upset. But he points out in his book, God Forsaken, even during the Enlightenment, the cause of earthquakes were not known. So it's natural for Voltaire, Hume, and others to portray earthquakes as somehow pointless and gratuitous. They agreed with ancient primitive consensus that the earthquakes have no other purpose than to arbitrary divine action. So these great minds were, kind of thinking the same thing any primitive guy would think. And in the poem, it starts, "What advantage can result to all from wretched Lisbon's lamentable fall?" So he writes, it just strikes him, well, you can't blame, can you blame God for this? And he didn't think so. This is where, I hope you can stick with me a bit. I better get another thing to drink here, but Dinet D'Souza points out, and kind of reminiscent of, what's that movie called, How Great Our God Is, where he talks about all the, there's all these things where our moon's just in the right position for the gravity, the way our oceans are designed. Well, he just starts off with plate tectonics because that's what causes earthquakes. And that was proposed in the 20s or 30s, and it was kind of ignored as a joke for a long time until like the 1960s. And now it's kind of considered a fact. But this is just little excerpts just to give you the idea. I didn't have time to memorize these facts, but these are the kind of things that they usually call Earth like that Goldilocks zone, like everything's just right for life to exist. As giant plates move and rub against each other, they sometimes rupture, the crust of the surface cracking and splitting. That's how we get earthquakes. Volcanoes occur when scalding materials from the Earth's interior are coughed up and spewed out. When the cracking and rupture happens on the ocean floor, huge quantities of water can get displaced, and this is how we get seaquakes or tsunamis. And in the book Rare Earth, it was written by a paleontologist and astronomer. They observed that we're the only planet that they know of so far, anyhow, that we have plate tectonics. And the authors showed that the plate tectonics is an essential requirement for life on the planet. Plate tectonics is also largely responsible for enabling differences in land elevation, thus separating the land from the water. Without plate tectonics, the authors write, the oceans contain enough water to cover the spherical Earth to a depth of 4,000 meters. If the surface of the planet varied only a few kilometers in elevation, Earth would be devoid of land. And it says, keep in mind that while 2/3 of the Earth is covered by water already, over 2/3 of all animal species live on land. And he goes on to point out that even fish might not survive. Plate tectonics explains the biodiversity we find on land because it causes the breaking up of land into continents, each with its own distinctive topography and climate, and thus enabling the flourishing of different forms of life. We should be misled to thinking that, if you got rid of plate tectonics, that we still have at least oceans swimming with fish, because all life, after all, depends on the carbon dioxide level. So, we think of carbon dioxide as being bad, but you actually have to have to hold in the atmosphere. Of course, it recirculates minerals and that is vital to life. It makes possible Earth's magnetic field, which without it, the Earth and its cargo would just, its life would be burned by potentially lethal cosmic rays. So without plate tectonics, we wouldn't have protection from solar radiation coming in. Just like that movie, Bill Bryson wrote a book about a short history of nearly everything. It's secular, but I really see the effects of God in that. It just goes, it's the sun. The sun can also be damaging. It can be harmful. It can cause radiation, but also we couldn't be here without it. It's precisely at the right position. It's 8 light minutes away from the Earth. If the sun were only a little further, we'd freeze. If it was even closer, we'd bake. Water, water, the devastation of water, but, I won't even go on with that then, because, that we can't live very long without water. We can go maybe 40 days without food, like Jesus, but we couldn't last a week without water, especially under some conditions. But I try just to imply the impact of that, and it's like, well, I kind of appreciate his point that things aren't that arbitrary, that God does this, and I think, I can understand Voltaire's position. You can't just tell anyone that suffers these things, and I wouldn't even have enough appreciation that you can just tell them, well, things will be okay, and it's all for the best, the best of all possible worlds. And when he writes his book, he talks a lot about, he has debates with Bart Ehrman. He's agnostic, not quite atheist, but he kind of pointed out that he kind of debates this guy, and Bart Ehrman is agnostic. He used to be a very strong Christian. He kind of lost his faith along the way through his study, actually, where some people become stronger in faith. But he pointed out the one thing that he found comforting, even though he was an agnostic, he found comfort when, because Bart Ehrman wrote his own book, kind of putting God in a bad light about these disasters, and I think this is Dinesh D'Souza's the answer to it. And so one of the last things I want to do is read Ecclesiastes 9 from the Clear Word, but also one of the other philosophers, Rousseau, had actually said too, is like, well, he wrote this letter to Voltaire, if they didn't build these buildings the way they did, they stacked them up, they were tall, straight buildings. They built them so that they had no regard for people, so when these events happen, it could happen. And I think his point was that sometimes we live in a world that, if there's fire, it could be a good thing, but don't go touching the fire, or don't go lighting matches, in a wrong place, or, so we have a kind of a responsibility, we're not that helpless with those things. We're kind of helpless like an earthquake to God, we always are in constant need of God, but, we can't just make bad decisions and expect that we can blame God for them. The original idea of compassion, for sufferers, and Jesus had compassion, and the original idea, I think, in the language is to suffer with, and that's what Jesus did with us. So the last thing, this is from that book. You may think it's kind of, a book about philosophy and using jokes, but I think this kind of expresses our attitudes towards asking God for help in our suffering. As grandmother's watching her grandchild playing on the beach, and a huge wave comes in and washes them out to sea, and she just begs, "Please, God, save my only grandson. I beg of you, save him, bring him back." So a big wave comes in and lands the grandchild right back on the beach, and he's all safe and sound. And the grandmother looks up in heaven and says, "Well, he had a hat." And I thought it was funny, but it just goes to show you, suffering is kind of, we should really count our blessings on things, and I think that's true with me. I speak for myself that, we always think we're in a bad situation, and what Pastor Arner's going through, and God bless us that we do have illness as a family. I have to, I usually feel sorry for myself, but my wife's healthy. She has an egg allergy, but we found out at least, and we're together. And I think you can blame God for things, but what could God possibly do? We sometimes question, why didn't God do this and why didn't God do that? I think that that's why we like to submit to His will, because we know any long term of things He knows better. And sometimes what we ask for or what we think is a problem is actually the best thing for us in our lives. So, Ecclesiastes 9, I'm going to read from the NIV, but It's kind of called it's a wisdom book, but it's kind of a wisdom that's skeptical about wisdom. And I think in Candide, his philosophy was skeptical about philosophy, because in the end of Candide, he ends up just tending his garden. He's just working. He thinks, well, he's not going to be philosophical and things about it anymore. He's just going to work, and that'll take away his poverty, and that'll take away his other vices, because he'll just be working. And I think Voltaire in his life, he was not a pious person, I don't think. He was raised by the Jesuits, and he had a sense of God, and he believed in God, but he had quite a life, there was women, there was everything else in his life. He kind of like, is one of those guys, he fought against the rich and powerful, but yet he was one of the rich and powerful. But he stayed, when he came back to France, he lived real close to the Switzerland border in a small town, because he had to be ready to leave, because he just couldn't stop insulting people, but powerful people. But what he did, and so again, it's like that Jimmy Stewart movie. What Jimmy Stewart's job was to give affordable housing to people, to give them a chance, not to take advantage of the poor. One of those sins, robbing the poor. So, and towards the end of his life, what he did with this small town that he lived in, he created an industry. He created all these different shops and things, and he created housing that these people could actually afford. And he did it. Of course, he lost money on it, but that's what he did with the end of his life. So, I think I could say all of these philosophers were right about some things and they were wrong about some things, and you can't blame Voltaire for what he was feeling. But then again, the Dinesh D'Souza points out, these things going on, what Candide goes, but look at all these advancements. He might have felt helpless in what's going on in this world, and is optimism a bad thing, but look at all those things that happened, all the improvements in medicines and lifespans, and a lot of diseases that we had in that 18th century are gone. So there was a reason, and I think the optimism started out in America, and I think that's why we came in the Lamb, and we start talking about America out of those things, which is inevitable, and that's when it'll become a dragon. Ecclesiastes 9, so I concluded that no matter what good a man knows, his future rests in the hands of God. No one knows whether good times or bad times await him. The end of his life is no different from the righteous or the wicked, the good or the bad, for those who are religious and those who are not, for those who sacrifice for the cause of God and those who do not. When it comes to dying, a good man is no better off than a sinner, and a man who keeps his word has no advantage over one who doesn't. The great evil in this world is that the same destiny awaits everyone, the righteous and the wicked alike. Men's hearts are full of evil and devoid of reason. Then afterward they die. But there's one thing in this life that doesn't change, that is hope. Even a live dog is better than a dead lion. Yes, the living know that someday they will die, but the dead know nothing. They are no longer rewarded here for what they have done, and gradually they'll fade from memory and are forgotten. Their love, hatred, and jealousy are all gone and buried. Never again do they have any part in anything that's happening here on earth. So, hope, and when you read the Bible verses in Romans, hope doesn't come easy. You can talk that there's a possible such thing as cheap grace, but there's no cheap hope. And I think that's why Jesus is like the true hope, the hope and glory. So we know that the Greeks, even when they talked about Pandora, and she let out all the vices, greed and everything left, she let out hope. And as a kid, when I first read it, I thought, well, at least that's something. But to the Greeks, that was another vice. So I think when we're talking about Jesus being the real hope, it's a very exceptional thing. It's a thing that kind of hope doesn't exist anywhere else. So anything else is not real. It's a vice, but the hope in Jesus is the true thing. So I think that's it. I only planned for 20 minutes, so hopefully it wasn't longer than that. So I know some of you want to go out trick-or-treating, right? Or hand out glow tracts in the rain. Okay, thank you, everybody. Happy Sabbath.